Jack Tucker, welcome to Improvisationally Speaking.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. Really glad to be here.
Yeah, it's just terrific. This is going to be the first of my 2 space episodes, and you will be my maiden voyage into that. So, Jack, you work for SpaceX, and you have your own organization, New Space Ventures, that you've been running now for how long?
A couple months. We started right at the end of February, beginning of March, and that would be New Space Ventures.
Okay.
I do that on the side, after my day job. By night, I run New Space Ventures. What I'm trying to do is help collect all of these new space companies that are popping up around the world and share them with the space community.
So I have a question. When you get up in the morning, do you pinch yourself to like that you have a career in space exploration with a company that is pushing us into outer space farther?
It is pretty cool. And I feel incredibly lucky to be here, but I really can't say that I expected to be here. Most of the people that at least that I've ran into here at the company or at other aerospace companies, they go to school for engineering, and the hot thing is to try and work for a really awesome aerospace company, whether that be SpaceX or Virgin Galactic or Blue Origin, or even like if you're really into airplanes like Boeing or Lockheed Martin or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't me. I kind of you can say I'm an accidental space enthusiast.
What is? Do you remember the first time that you looked up in the sky and realized there was something more than just, wow, those are really cool stars and stuff?
Yes. My dad had a small telescope when we were growing up, and he and my mom would take my siblings and I camping like every summer, and he'd bring the telescope, and so we'd look at the stars, and he'd point out the constellations, and I always really appreciated that. But unlike others, I guess that gave me an appreciation for science and for space. But that actually didn't drive me into the space industry. I went to the Air Force Academy, and I got a degree in systems engineering. But my whole intention of going to the academy in the first place was to be a fighter pilot. But fate intervened. My eyes turned out to be too bad, like a couple months before graduation. But anyway, like it turned out great. I went the sole engineering route for the Air Force, and in one of those assignments, I was just literally assigned to the space industry, and that's how I got into this, and I absolutely loved it, and it was kind of happenstance.
So you were assigned to the space industry. There's a program within the military that you were assigned to that was, working in space?
Yeah. So, well, my first assignment after the academy was leading a team of test engineers in Florida, at Eglin Air Force Base, doing systems and software testing for military systems. I learned a ton. Made a lot of rookie manager mistakes. A 22-year-old coming out of the academy, all of a sudden being in charge of people. It's a bit rocky. But from that, my very next assignment was at Los Angeles Air Force Base in El Segundo, and most people don't know there's an Air Force Base in Los Angeles County, and it's really, really tiny, really like a couple blocks in area, and pretty close to LAX, and it's just a bunch of office buildings, and what is in those office buildings were people like me to help manage the space programs that the Air Force has.
Really?
And one of those programs was called EELV, Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle, And when I showed up, I learned that I was a new Delta IV rocket structures engineer, and so that was pretty shocking. Um, I knew I had orders to go to Los Angeles Air Force Base and report into a certain unit, and I knew that unit dealt with space, but I really wasn't sure what I would be doing.
Mm.
And it was really really exciting, drinking from a fire hose. Uh, um, Somebody thought I could do the job, and after experiencing my very first rocket launch firsthand, I was actually on console for that mission down at Cape Canaveral. It was for a Delta IV launch. I was hooked, and
Wow.
I wanted to learn as much as I could, not just about the rocket, and and the people that helped build it, but about the industry in general.
You went into this a newbie, right? You didn't have all the experience one might have moving into this thing. Were you nervous taking on such a big role?
Absolutely, I was nervous. I was certainly a newbie. I At the Air Force Academy, at least for the handful of years that I was there, regardless of what your major was, even if you majored in history or English, you were required to take astronautical engineering courses. And so I was a system engineer, but I still took astro, and I did pretty well in that apparently, and that was part of the reason why I was chosen for the role. But
Mm.
um, I had to break out these dusty textbooks to remind myself like what was going on with some of these the structural designs and the orbital mechanics and that sort of thing. It certainly wasn't. I was lucky that I kind of kept some of these textbooks around, um, but I was really nervous. But that's kind of what you're trained for, being a military officer. They train you as an officer, and they expect you to be able to lead in almost any type of situation.
Mm.
So regardless of the role, the aspects of leadership don't really change, and so they figure we spent a lot of money on putting you through school and giving you this awesome education. We're going to kind of put you wherever we think you should go.
And what do you feel was the biggest challenge in that transition? I mean, you said that as an officer, you're trained to move into a situation of which you don't have enough to be comfortable, but you must have enough to be effective. And I was wondering, what was the hardest? What was the biggest challenge of being a brand new manager of people doing things that you didn't know much about, or you felt you didn't know much about?
You very very quickly you have to get over being afraid of asking dumb questions. Um, just ask all the questions you could ever think of, and tell people to slow down. Ask people to repeat themselves. It may be awkward. It definitely shows others where your knowledge gaps are.
Mm-hmm.
But I think especially if you're leading a team and you're working closely with them and you're showing them that you're invested in this, and you really, really want to know exactly what it is they do and how they do it so that you can lead them more effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they realize it or not, I feel at a subconscious level they start to trust you more.
I see. How did that mindset work as you transitioned? Because eventually you moved from the military into the private industry.
Right.
How did that transition happen for you? In light of the fact that everybody thinks of the military as very rigid, this is the way we've done it, this is the way we do it, structure, 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 you do what you're told kind of environment. Yeah, how was that transition into the free market? Did it feel a little bit unwieldy, a little too free, or what?
It was. I knew it would be quite a ride. I guess is the easiest way to put it. Because yes, I went straight from high school into a military academy, and I had spent years in the military, and I was knowingly going from, like you say, the structured organization to SpaceX, which is famous for fast iterative designs, moving fast and breaking things. And but that's what I was looking for. I knew that because SpaceX means SpaceX, they weren't looking to ever set a mold. They weren't looking for somebody who was going to come in and say, well, this is how we did it in my organization, or this is how we've done it in the past. Where I think, and I think I used this in my interview, one of the interviews I had for SpaceX. I think the value that I bring is experiencing firsthand just how the structure works at a bureaucratic organization. Because knowing how that works, you're able to, knowing how a bureaucratic structure works and looks like, you're able to then put that into an organization that doesn't want to look like that. You're kind of able to look at it from the negative and say, well, rather than doing that, let's actually set up our own policies and processes that kind of take care of that for us on the back end, so we can just focus on what we do best, engineering and trying to produce rockets fast, and keeping the organization as lean as possible.
Would you say then that you have helped to create a bureaucratic organization at SpaceX, or is SpaceX absolutely, their mindset is not of bureaucratic and organization, but rather something else? What do you say to that?
Well, we don't like the word bureaucracy here at SpaceX, and I can certainly empathize with that. But as an organization grows larger and larger, certain systems do need to be established. A framework needs to go up to allow freedom within that framework, and that's certainly what my part of my role is to kind of help establish or make recommendations for how we should go forward, so that as a company grows larger, you don't have inefficiencies that crop up as the scaling occurs. Something may have worked, or you may have been able to toss a bunch of people at a certain problem when the organization is small and compact. But as you grow larger, if you're still trying to toss people at a problem or a issue, it just requires more resources to do so, and then it becomes really inefficient. So one of the things that we try to instill in lieu of bureaucracy are systems and automation, so that you don't have people doing things. You have a computer that can make or an algorithm that can make a logical conclusion, and then notify the right set of people.
I see. Does your approach of integrating research and development into operations from your scheduling standpoint, is that kind of evidence of what you just said about how SpaceX thinks?
I would say so. I certainly didn't have a background in integrating R&D into a production environment while in the military. So this was kind of coming into a new world for me. But I quickly learned that most companies that produce a physical product, they kind of have two separate operational lines. One where they do the R&D, they can tweak the product, make mistakes, figure out how to build it. That's the big thing. They figure out how to build it separately. And then, you have the main production line that once you figure out how to build it, you just churn out a bunch of them. You retool everything, and you have a system already in place to build whatever you were designing. At SpaceX, we don't. Like this, we're trying to build rockets as fast as we can using almost completely the same set of machines and tools that are building our main production vehicles. And so integrating R&D into a normal operations flow can get pretty hectic, and you do need to establish a prioritization system so that folks on the floor know when it's time to, okay, drop this one piece that's actually going to go fly, and now it's time to work on this this R&D component that is needed for testing and may not fly. Um, the and making those signals to production as clear as possible is really what my team and I try to do. Yeah.
Why? Well, let me ask that next. But the big thing I want to ask is, does that process of bringing R&D and operations so close together, does that not place, like if you have astronauts that are going up on one of your rockets, and one of your rockets happens to be in the midst of research development and changes and whatnot, and then it's also in operation, doesn't that make it a little bit more dangerous?
It does if you don't have systems and processes in place. One of the things that SpaceX has worked with very closely is with NASA and with the Air Force to be certified by their operations, basically being blessed by the Air Force and NASA and saying, okay, we understand how you're building launch vehicles. It's very different than launch vehicles that have ever been built before, but we understand it and we trust it enough that we're okay with you continuing to do this as long as these certain risk mitigating factors are in place. Because you're absolutely right. You don't want to mix up an R&D piece and a flight unit. That would be really, really bad.
Yeah.
And which goes to the whole point of tracking like every single component that goes onto the rocket. We call that traceability.
Yeah.
And having accurate traceability, like really knowing that this bolt is going on this unit and this unit is scheduled to fly at this time, is very important. Which is also why my team is so necessary, because even though we have an entire automated system, again, the least amount of people possible, we have an entire automated system to manage traceability with, barcode scanning and everything like that, knowing what to build and when to build it, and telling that to the technician on the floor that's going to pick up the piece and hold it in their hand. And if they accidentally just grab the wrong one, that's a problem.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a combining of different systems. A system to tell them what to do, a system to tell them when to do it, and a system to track what they've done and where it's going.
And would you say that most companies would like to be able to be in a place to be able to do this, and they don't because they don't have, they don't feel confident that they'll get that straight every time and run into trouble, or?
Well, I guess that's kind of what makes SpaceX is, or just any company that's doing R&D and trying to develop new technologies, that you're going to make mistakes. But you need to invest heavily in a solid team of people that when mistakes occur, like you know that, all right, this bad thing happened, this set of people is going to fix it and then make sure it doesn't happen again. Like you put a lot of effort into learning from your mistakes.
Totally.
Organizations that are trying to get there, I don't think every organization needs to get to this level, especially if you're a consumer product like auto manufacturing. You don't want to build a different car every single time. Like we're essentially building a different rocket every single time because we're constantly testing new technology. But for consumers, the Toyota Camry that just came off the line, the very next one probably should be very, very similar. maybe a different color of paint.
Totally. You talked a minute ago about failure, and I'm really glad you did, because I know from talking to you, you've clearly adopted the idea that failure is not necessarily a bad thing, and it can be and should be a good thing when you treat it right. And I'm wondering, how do you encourage that with your people that you work with at SpaceX?
Well, I mean, it's encouraged from the top down. The people that we bring on to SpaceX, the people that we hire, and I think this goes for every successful business organization. You need to build a culture, not where failure is okay, but that if failure occurs, it's okay. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but you don't want to be okay with people making mistakes, but you want to give them the confidence that if they do make the mistakes, like, all right, Steve, X, Y, and Z happened. Can you help us fix this problem, or do you know what you did wrong? And in many cases, the person that made the mistake, it wasn't necessarily their fault. At least that's something that we're seeing all the time. It's either they installed the wrong bolt, and the reason why they installed the wrong bolt is the two bolts literally look exactly the same except the threads, and so like that's almost not their fault, because the bins were right next to each other. The label that tells them what the difference is like in really small type at the end. So all right, a mistake was made. It was caught because we have good risk mitigating factors. And so going forward, we want to involve them in the resolution process. Make sure that, we know that we show them that they're integral to the company, that they're integral to the solution. And I think that just builds a lot of confidence in that employee and wants them to, it helps make them want to keep working here.
That's great. What about when you have a stakeholder, maybe someone who you may report to, or someone else who relies on your doing things right, maybe monetarily or professionally or otherwise? How do you deal with when a mistake is made by you or someone that you're responsible for, and how do you communicate that with the person? Especially, have you ever had a situation where a person may have not been receptive to it the way you had wanted them to, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so at least what I hear you asking is how do you give negative feedback to an employee, and then how do you kind of convey what had happened to your higher ups? Is that kind of correct?
I think I understand the negative feedback to the employee. You made that clear, but when you have a department who relies on you, I'm going to just make something up. You've got a project you're working on, something gets messed up on your project, which then affects them and pushes their project go back by a month. And that costs them $3.8 million. And they're really mad at you because that shouldn't have happened. That mistake was made and it cost them money and time. How do you deal with people who are relying on your team to do it, but then there's a mistake made and it ends up costing them personally?
I'd be lying if I said that doesn't happen.
Good. I'm glad you're honest.
And that, so far, at least in my team's experience and my own personal experience, it's really just making sure that you build those relationships with your stakeholders as solidly as possible when the times are good, because the times aren't always going to be good. There's going to be situations where you accidentally impact them unknowingly, or they do the same thing to you. But having frequent tag ups and explaining, hey, this may not affect you yet, but this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it, I think goes a long way, because when shit does hit the fan, and it will, you already need to have that basis of trust in knowing that they've always, at least for me and my stakeholders are, because it's it's scheduling the production line and using the systems we have. So my stakeholders are sales, marketing, engineering, the production managers, like it's all of them,
Yeah.
finance. So it's really, really important that we're always talking with them. And when changes to the schedule happen, that they get notified as soon as possible. And before we make a change to the schedule, that we involve their input. Because if for exactly the point you mentioned, like we don't want to make a change that's going to negatively impact them, where we had never anticipated it, but it's something that that sales is working on. You know, they have a plan to do X, Y, and Z, and we never thought about that. Or we build a plan that doesn't factor in a whole engineering unit that the engineering team wants to toss in there. And in some cases that, well, they don't actually need to do that engineering unit at that time. They can push it or pull it. It doesn't need to be slotted in particularly there. But there are other times where it has to be done, and the testing needs to be good enough for us to like fly a certain mission, and so then it becomes really important. But it's laying the groundwork with all those relationships at the start that's kind of going to save you.
It's like hyper trust and hyper communication, like always communicating, and then paying it forward, making sure the relationship's good, and you show them that you care about them essentially. And then when things go wrong, you have that that you've already earned, I guess. Yeah.
You've earned that trust. Maybe it's deteriorated a little bit, but then you give them confidence that, okay, look, we have a good working relationship. This bad thing happened, but here's what I'm going to be doing or going forward with to make sure something like that doesn't happen again.
Yep, got it. What are you most excited about happening in space exploration in the next, I don't know, what do you think, 5 years, 10, 20 years, 50 years, century? What are you most excited about?
Well, I mean, let's kind of go out kind of decade by decade. If you asked me 5 years ago, I would have said that the most exciting thing in space exploration would be reusable rockets, and we're starting to see that now. You know, we've launched a couple reusable rockets. It's a huge milestone. For me, like the next 10 years, I'd have to say large privately held satellite constellations. Satellite constellations historically, like in the last in the last 50 years, have really been government organizations. You know, the United States, Europe, and Russia in particular, with the global positioning satellites. The Iridium satellite system, is privately held, but that costs a lot of money to put up there. But I'm talking large satellite constellations that are privately held that are in low Earth orbit. These small CubeSats that you can build 1,000 of them for the cost of like 4 or 5 major government satellites. You can toss a lot of them up there. They're really cheap to build. The technology is even getting better and faster, and the barrier to entry for putting something up into space is dropping fast. So to me, what's at least near term, one of the most exciting things is going to be a lot more satellite constellations doing a lot more cool things. Planet recently, they just had, I think, like 34 satellites, small CubeSats launched on one Russian rocket last week. They have now the largest satellite constellation in the world up there with all of their Dove satellites. And for the first time in history, I'm not sure if you or your listeners were aware of this, but for the first time in history, because of Planet Labs, we're able to take an entire picture of the whole Earth once a day. Like every single square inch of the Earth gets its picture taken every single day for the first time ever. And like how amazing is that? And I can only imagine what some of the other cool things we're going to start seeing coming from space technology with large satellite constellations in the near future.
Yeah.
And I guess with that, with large satellite constellations, you have the problem, or one of the problems, of debris.
Yeah.
Too many satellites in low Earth orbit, it gets really, really crowded. The good thing about CubeSats or nanosats, or small satellites in low Earth orbit, is that they're pretty low. Their orbits deteriorate pretty fast. Um, so I don't see that as being a problem. But even just the slightly larger ones that stay up there for a number of years, or they're in a highly inclined orbit or elliptical orbit where it's harder for them to just burn up and deteriorate their orbit on their own. We're going to start seeing companies, and you can look on my New Space Ventures database, and you'll see some companies already that are developing technology to help remove space debris. And I see companies with their own orbital robots helping to remove space debris.
Wow.
As kind of the precursor to just more advanced spacecraft. Like, we're going to learn a lot from trying to do things like that, and all that technology is then going to be applied to making more intricate and more complicated spacecraft that do more things. I think, like, in the late 2020s and early 2030s, we're going to see the first people on Mars.
You think so, huh?
At least that's my prediction. And I think around that time, we're going to start putting a lot more effort into establishing a kind of like a base of operations around the moon. People have talked about mining asteroids, but personally, I think it's a lot easier to go to the moon and establish a base for refueling with helium-3, or mining the moon for resources, because it's right there. There are a number of organizations and groups that are trying to get more people excited about what's called cislunar operations. And so any spacecraft or space station that is in orbit around the moon, that is kind of a way station for other activities. I think that's going to be maybe not in the 2030s, maybe a little further out, 2040s, 2050s, but I'm hoping that by the end of the century, we're going to have a much freer traffic into and out of Earth's atmosphere. You see companies like Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic right now that are trying to build up the citizen astronaut mentality, right?
Yeah.
Space tourism, or just people going up into space. I think we're still a long way from that. A couple decades at least, where people going into space is just kind of normal. The way I kind of think about it is, once we start having rocket launches where there aren't anybody, there isn't anybody standing on the sidelines cheering when it's successful. When rocket launches become boring.
As boring as an airplane taking off, right?
Right. People haven't stood at the edge of runways to cheer airplanes taking off since the Wright brothers. And like, once we start doing that with rockets, once that starts happening, like, then we're really getting somewhere.
Yeah. That leads me to my final question to you. That is, in your work, as you look at your life's work here and your career, what do you want to have had done in your career? What legacy are you personally looking to leave?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I don't think I've ever been asked that. Legacy. Well, I don't know. I want to do my part to help humanity. Like, all I'm doing with New Space Ventures is collecting what's already out there and kind of sharing it with the world. And a lot of people have really been excited about that. And that makes me happy that people are finding use in this information, that entrepreneurs have a platform to kind of share what they're trying to do, that investors are able to go to a centralized place and find like the next big thing for them to put their money into. Like I see that as helping out the industry right now. My legacy, I don't know. I want to be associated with the space industry. I'm really lucky to have the opportunity to work with SpaceX. I'm really lucky to be in contact with so many people around the world that are involved with space and helping them out however I can. One of the things that I also do on the side is I advise space startups in trying to find product market fit. So I don't know, my legacy, I guess, just helping the space industry get off the ground and telling more people about it, telling as many people about it as I can, because there were a number of polls done with just the general public about the space industry, and over, I think it was like 70 or 80% in one poll still thought the space shuttle was still flying. Most people don't know that the technology is here for us to do space mining. Like we can do that. It's just a lot of public will and trust that we can, because to do that right now it's going to cost a lot of money, and a lot of people don't see the value in that. But I guess part of what I hope to do is give people a how do I put this? A way to think more long term.
Good. Speaking of which, if our listeners wanted to learn more about New Space Ventures, where would you direct them?
Well, actually, we don't really have a website right now. It's literally just a shared Google spreadsheet.
Okay.
But we are building a website. But they can, if they would like to know more, they can email me at jtucker@newspace.ventures.
JTUCKER at New Space Ventures, all one word.
Newspace.ventures. It's actually its own domain.
Own domain. Newspace.ventures. Okay.
Yes.
Good. Jack Tucker, it's been a pleasure having you on Improvisationally Speaking. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.